It's October 2023 and I'm standing on a bridge above the river Great Ouse looking towards the site of a Norman castle that lasted less than 200 years. Located on a fording point of the river, almost at the midpoint between its source in Cyresham, Northamptonshire, and its mouth in the Wash at King's Lynn in Norfolk, the town of Bedford can trace its history back at least as far as the Saxon period. The town's name is believed to be derived from the name of the Saxon chief Beda, combined with a river crossing to become Bedaford. The Anglo-Saxon king Offa of Mercia, most famous for the defensive dyke that still helps to define the English-Welsh border, was buried in the town in 796. The site long since lost to time, but believed to be in what is today's St Paul's Church. The minster church that King Offa had built in the town was destroyed by Viking invasion around 1010, the replacement church later being destroyed itself by an expanded Bedford Castle around 1216. The third incarnation of the church dates back, in parts, to the early 13th century, though it's undergone significant alterations, extensions, rebuilds and restorations since then to create the building that stands the heart of Bedford Civic Centre, surrounded by the law courts, town hall and corn exchange. During the period of Viking rule in Britain, the town was on the border between the Viking-run Danelaw and the Saxon Wessex, changing hands on a number of times, and when not under control of the Vikings, being regularly attacked. Relatively late in the day after the Norman invasion, a castle was built in the town sometime after 1100 by King Henry I. The castle played a prominent part in the Anarchy, the civil war that followed the death of Henry I, between forces loyal to his daughter, Empress Matilda, and his nephew, Stephen of Blois. The final outcome being Stephen's remaining as king, but Matilda's son, Henry, becoming the heir and eventual Henry II. The castle also played a major role in the First Barons' War that occurred after King John refused to abide by the terms of Magna Carta, which he'd only signed a few months earlier in 1215. At the start of the war, the castle was held by William de Beauchamp, but he rebelled against King John, so the castle was seized by Fulks de Brute, who was loyal to the king. After the war, Fulks expanded the site considerably, including the destruction of St Paul's Church, but ownership was contested, and in 1224 King Henry III decided that Bedford Castle should be returned to William de Beauchamp. With Fulks refusing, the king took legal action against him. Fulks responded by imprisoning Henry of Baybrook, who had been appointed as judge to oversee the case against him. King Henry mobilised an army and laid siege to the castle, and after a long series of battles over 8 weeks involving trebuchets and even miners digging their way into the inner bailey by undermining a part of the wall, the castle surrendered on the 15th of August 1224. With the siege over, Henry III ordered the castle to be dismantled and the stone used to rebuild many of the buildings that had been destroyed to build it, including St Paul's Church. The rest of the stone was helped to build other parts of the town, and local tradition suggests that the first stone bridge across the Ouse was built with stone from the castle. By 1361, the site was described as a void plot of old, enclosed by walls, with just a fragment of the bailey and the mound of the motte surviving, much as they do to today. During the Middle Ages, Bedford became one of the main centres of England's lace industry, which continued to be important to the town's economy until the early 20th century. The history of the town, its industry and people are told in The Higgins. The town's museum is named for the Higgins family, a brewing family whose house and brewery the museum now occupy. The complex includes the original Higgins family house, the brewery, and new linking buildings, which between them house museum exhibits on the history of the area in chronological order, starting with when the land that Bedford now occupies was deep below the sea, through prehistory with the customary mammoth teeth, to the Saxons, Vikings, Normans, and through to the modern day, albeit at the time of visiting, the upper part of the exhibition dealing with Bedford from the industrial era onward was closed due to water damage caused by a leaking roof. The The buildings also house the town's art gallery and its collections of paintings and artworks. From the art gallery there's direct access into the original Higgins house, which has been furnished as it would have looked during the Victorian era. The upper floor also contains temporary exhibition space and the design gallery, which has artefacts from the decorative arts collection of Cecil Higgins that acted as the founding collection of the museum. Outside, it's possible to make out the different buildings of the complex, from the Higgins house to the original brewery buildings. Nearby is also a model of how the area would have looked in the early 13th century, when this space would have been inside the castle. Across the road, the Panacea Museum tells the history of this religious society, the belief that the second coming of Jesus was imminent. Over a number of years, at the start of the 20th century, they purchased neighbouring buildings to create their Ark complex, which the museum occupies today. Bedford appears to be a bit of a hotbed for nonconformist religion, with perhaps one of the most famous adherents being local boy John Bunyan, who, during his 12-year imprisonment in Bedford jail, wrote The Pilgrim's Progress, the second most translated book in the world after the Bible. On the site of a barn that he purchased in 1672 to conduct worship in sits the Bunyan Meeting Free Church, which includes a museum dedicated to the man and his works. John Bunyan was born in the small village of Elstow, about 1.5 miles to the southwest of Bedford, and whilst today the village has been swallowed up into an ever-expanding Bedford, it still retains its historic core around the village green, overlooked by the Moot Hall and church of Elstow Abbey, which would already have been old buildings when John was born in 1628. The Moot Hall was originally built around 1500 as a market hall for the neighbouring abbey, constructed in the prevailing Tudor style, with a timber frame infilled with wattle and daub. Following the dissolution of the monasteries, the estate was leased to Edward Harvey. His daughter married local Member of Parliament Humphrey Radcliffe, and in July 1553 he was granted ownership of the estate. The estate was acquired by brewer Samuel Whitbread in 1792, and the family continued to own the site right up until 1950, when they presented it to Bedfordshire County Council in advance of the Festival of Britain. And yes, that is the same Whitbreads that today, though now a public rather than a family company, own Premier Inn. During ownership by the Whitbread family, they allowed a religious group known as the Congregation of Bunyan Meeting to use the hall for their meetings. Following ownership passing to the council, the building was restored and it became a museum displaying items relating to John Bunyan. Today, the collection has grown to include local paintings, and the top floor has been furnished to show how it would have looked when it was used as a manorial court. The neighbouring abbey was founded around 1075 by Judith, Countess of Huntingdon and niece of William the Conqueror. The monastery was closed as part of a dissolution in 1539, and the land, as of the Moot Hall, was leased to Edward Harvey. The nave of the church building was retained as a parish church, but the remainder of the building was demolished after 1580. In 1616, Sir Thomas Hillersdon purchased the rest of the monastic buildings and incorporated them into a new house, which itself later became a ruin. Another ruin 5 miles to the southwest is Houghton House, which is believed to be the model for House Beautiful in the Pilgrim's Progress. The house was originally built between 1615 and 1621 as a hunting lodge by Mary Herbert, the Dowager Countess of Pembroke, on a ridge high above the Bedfordshire countryside, so it would have been a strong local landmark in the days of John Bunyan. Shortly after construction was completed, the Countess was visited by King James I, but shortly after that, she died of smallpox, and 2 years later, the estate reverted to the King, who then granted it to Thomas Bruce, 1st Earl of Elgin. The Bruce family resided in the house for 3 generations until the 3rd Earl of Elgin, confusingly also called Thomas Bruce, was forced into exile on the continent due to his loyalty to the recently deposed King James II in 1696. In 1738, the estate was sold to John Russell, the 4th Duke of Bedford, whose main house was Woburn Abbey, about 7 miles away. His son Francis lived in Houghton from 1764 until he died in a hunting accident in 1767, at which point the estate passed to his son, also called Francis. The younger Francis let the deer park to a neighbour, but subsequently found that without the grounds he was unable to let the house after he moved into Woburn. Considering the house a liability, Francis ordered the house to be dismantled with the furnishing stripped out and the roof removed and sold as building materials. The staircase from the house survived and was moved into the Swan Hotel in Bedford, where it still exists today. With the building left open to the elements, it slowly started to decay. Thankfully for the building's survival, the Earl of Upper Ossory, who owned nearby Ampthill Park, liked the look of the ruins, so after commissioning Lancelot Capability Brown to landscape the grounds of his estate, he purchased the ruins of Houghton House to be included, which preserved the building as it was. Today, the building is owned and maintained by English Heritage, with work to stabilise the building being completed in 2006. 4 miles to the southeast, and also owned today by English Heritage, is another, slightly more intact country estate, Wrest Park. The estate was owned by the De Grey family for over 600 years, a well-established family that reached their greatest prominence when Edward IV made Edmund Grey his Lord Treasurer in 1463 and then Earl of Kent in 1465. Moneyed and with influence, the family faded into the background. The current stately home was only constructed between 1834 and 1839, replacing an older house about 200 metres to the south of the current building, located roughly where the garden's fountains now stand. The estate eventually passed into the hands of the Auberon Thomas Herbert, 9th Baron Lucas and 5th Lord Dingwall, But on the 3rd of November 1916, at the age of 40, while serving as a captain of a Royal Flying Corps, he was shot down over the German lines near the Somme, and within a couple of hours died of his wounds. Without any children of his own, the estate passed to his sister, Nan Herbert. At the time, Nan had been running Wrest Park as a hospital for wounded soldiers, though that had stopped in 1916 following a fire in the building. After inheriting the house alongside the titles following her brother's death, she sold the estate in 1917. The house and grounds passed through various hands, at one point being offices for Sun Alliance Insurance, and from 1948 home to the National Institute of Agricultural Engineering, later the Silsoe Research Institute, up until the institute closed in 2006. At that point, English Heritage took over the house and grounds and started on a long programme of restoring the house and gardens to their pre-1917 state, which in 2006 was predicted to take at least 20 years. Work on the gardens has now been completed and work on the house itself is well underway, but in 2023 there's still just a handful of rooms of the ground floor that are open to look around. Out in the gardens there's lots of spaces to explore, which include Chinese temples, a memorial column to Lancelot Capability Brown, who advised the de Grey family on the design and layout of their gardens. The Archers Pavilion at the far end of the long water that acts as a focal point from the house. Inside the pavilion, the painted ceiling has been restored to how it would have looked when it was completed in 1711. Other buildings that have been restored include the Bowling Green House, and the Orangery. Bedford is located on the Midland Main Line from London to St Pancras and at the northern end of the Thameslink network. Half-hourly trains from East Midlands run to London in around 45 minutes. Thameslink trains run every 15 minutes south to central London in around an hour and on to Gatwick Airport in under 2 hours. Trains also stop at Luton Airport Parkway for connections to Luton Airport. Luton Airport is the headquarters of EasyJet and a major hub for both Wizz and Ryanair, providing links across Europe. London Gatwick is London's second airport, a major hub for low-cost carriers EasyJet and Wizz, a secondary hub for British Airways and served by airlines from across North America, Europe, Africa, the Middle East and Asia.